We were slowly moving down Greenview Street, passing by the cozy little houses that adorned this small town. Behind the wheel of our car was Sheriff Tom Harding, my boss. He was lost in his thoughts, his gaze fixed on the road, and nothing could distract him. I had only recently arrived in Elmwood, and my first day in this new place was memorable thanks to meeting Tom. Back then, this 45-year-old man with a beard reached out his hand, smiled warmly, and shook mine like a fatherly figure. Without hesitation, he appointed me as his deputy, and we immediately got down to fulfilling our duties. Elmwood turned out to be so small that it could be called more of a large village than a town. Located on the edge of a vast forest at the foot of a majestic mountain range, it was an oasis of tranquility and safety. Crime here was rare, and the tight-knit and friendly community of residents created an atmosphere of cozy neighborliness, where everyone knew each other by name. Leaving behind the cozy neighborhood, our car smoothly rolled onto the highway. Fields surrounded us on both sides, stretching to the horizon, creating a sense of boundless freedom and space. Golden and green waves of grain swayed under the gentle summer breeze, like the sea under the soft caress of the wind. In the distance, against the blue sky, rose the silhouettes of mountains, lending grandeur and completeness to the landscape. As we progressed along the highway, we left behind the hustle and bustle of the town, immersing ourselves in the tranquility and peace that only nature can provide. Soon, a farm began to loom on the horizon, becoming clearer with each mile we passed. When we arrived, we were greeted by a well-maintained piece of land where picturesque landscapes and hard-working human labor harmoniously coexisted. Miller's Farm was an example of rural idyll. A majestic two-story house with white walls and a red roof proudly stood against the backdrop of green fields, while nearby were neat outbuildings, a barn, a chicken coop, and a cattle shed. Flower beds were arranged around the house, adding colorful accents to the overall picture, and rows of neatly trimmed shrubs adorned the paths leading to the house. In the backyard, a small lake was visible, adorned with a gazebo, the perfect place for family relaxation. As we approached the house, the sounds of life on the farm became clearer. The chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, and even the distant mooing of a cow created a cozy atmosphere. We parked the car at the porch, and as we got out, we headed towards the front door of the house. Climbing the creaky steps of the porch, we went upstairs and knocked on the door, expecting to meet the owners of this beautiful place. Soon the door opened, and a woman in her 50s appeared on the threshold. Her hair, interspersed with silver threads, was neatly gathered into a bun. Her face, with soft wrinkles around her eyes and lips, expressed kindness and hospitality. She was dressed in a simple but neat dress, adorned with an apron. Recognizing us, she warmly greeted us, and then turned and loudly called out inside the house, inviting her husband. In a moment, a man of about 55 appeared before us. His posture exuded strength and confidence, typical of someone who has spent most of their life outdoors. His face was adorned with a neatly trimmed beard of gray hair, and his gaze was penetrating and friendly. He wore a worn-out flannel shirt and jeans. "Hello, Tom," he greeted the sheriff. Then he shook his hand, after which he looked at me and said, "And this must be your new deputy. Hello, my name is John." He extended his hand, which I shook. "My name is Michael," I replied, to which the old man nodded. Then he casually turned to the sheriff. "How are things in town?" "Everything was quiet until an old ruin disturbed me. Tell me what happened to you." The sheriff replied with a smile. "You know, I wouldn't have bothered you if it weren't for something serious. My best cow has gone missing. She used to give me up to 13 gallons of milk a day. "It's such a pity she's gone. A big loss for us," the owner said with sadness in his voice. After a short pause, he added, "Well, let me show you where it happened." After his words, the farm owner led us to the spacious pen where about 50 cows grazed. Approaching the wooden fence, he pointed to the spot where the ground was disturbed, forming numerous tracks, and one of the fence beams was clearly damaged. "I suspect the thief got through this gap. In the summer, I leave the cows overnight in this pen. It's always been quiet here, and I've never worried about their safety. But look at this," John said, pointing to the damage. "Despite the break, I can't understand how someone could have taken such a large cow through this fence. The locks on the gates weren't tampered with, and if it were wild animals, there would be blood stains. But I found nothing like that." We carefully examined the scene of the incident, but it was impossible to determine who left these tracks. The ground was simply churned up, leaving no distinct shapes. After that, we conducted a survey of the area. Walking around the fence, we began to search for clues beyond its limits, but we couldn't find anything suspicious. In search of evidence, we decided to split up to cover more ground. The pen was located near the forest, and I headed towards the dense greenery, hoping to find some traces there. Soon my search was interrupted by Sheriff Harding's voice, calling out to me and waving his hand to beckon me over. Approaching closer, I noticed that his attention was focused on the ground. Bending down over the earth, Sheriff Harding carefully examined a huge footprint. Despite its blurry outlines, the print bore a striking resemblance to a human one, except for its abnormal size, about 15 inches in length. I, struck by such a sight, couldn't take my eyes off it, trying to understand how and who could have left it here. Meanwhile, the sheriff remained calm and focused, as if encountering such a thing was not new to him. He pulled out his smartphone and began to meticulously photograph the footprint from different angles, then took out a ruler and measured it. 15.5 inches, he muttered to himself, carefully jotting down the data in his notebook. Unable to contain my curiosity, I asked him what creature could have left such a footprint. The sheriff looked up at me and replied with a hint of skepticism in his voice, "It's not certain yet that it's a creature. There are plenty of pranksters in our country capable of such things, so it's too early to draw any conclusions." I nodded in agreement. Continuing our search for some time, we still couldn't find any additional evidence or clues that could shed light on the disappearance of the miller's cow. Feeling the weight of the moment, we returned to the farm to inform the Millers of the current status of the investigation. With sadness, but also understanding that everything possible had been done, we assured them that we would continue the search. The Millers thanked us for our efforts despite the lack of results. Then we headed to the neighboring farm, hoping that its inhabitants might have noticed something unusual or suspicious. However, after a series of questions, it became clear that nothing had been observed there that could be related to our case. The farm residents answered us in the negative, not hiding their surprise at what had happened. With this new information, but without additional evidence, we returned to the station. The journey back was filled with reflections on what other steps could be taken to solve this mystery. At the station, we had work to do in organizing the collected data and planning further actions. So passed the remainder of the day. I was awakened by the ringing of the phone. On the other end of the line was Sheriff Harding. His voice was subdued, but urgency was evident. "Get dressed and head to the address I'm sending you right now." Glancing at the clock, I saw that it was only 5 in the morning. Approaching the window, I noticed how the sky was slowly brightening, heralding a new day. Without delay, I quickly washed my face and dressed, trying to gather my thoughts and imagine what could require our attention so early. Starting the car, I headed to the address provided by the sheriff. Upon arrival, I found myself in front of a small house, cozily situated on the edge of the forest. It was a one-story building with wooden walls. The roof of the house was covered with shingles, some of which were moss-covered, indicating many years of its life next to the forest. Around the house, there was a small but well-kept garden. As I arrived, I saw that Sheriff Harding had also just arrived. He was slowly getting out of his patrol car parked nearby. His figure stood out against the morning light, beginning to filter through the dense foliage of the forest. As I stepped out of my car, he nodded towards the door. There stood a woman and a man. She was clearly distraught, crying while he tried to comfort her, embracing her shoulders. Approaching them, we became witnesses to their distress. The woman, barely noticing us, rushed towards us and pleaded anxiously, "Please find Bill." Sheriff Harding tried to reassure her. "Ma'am, please explain everything step by step. We're here to help you." She carefully wiped away her tears and, stuttering with excitement, began to explain. "I woke up in the middle of the night. I don't know. Maybe it was a premonition or something, but I couldn't sleep. I went out of my bedroom and decided to check on Bill, but when I looked into his room, he wasn't there. I panicked immediately and started looking for him, but he wasn't in the house. Together with Josh, we searched the entire house and yard, then expanded the search to the surroundings, but Bill was nowhere to be found." As she said this, tears overwhelmed her again. Sheriff Harding, displaying patience, gave her some time to calm down a bit before asking the next question. "Ma'am, was the front door locked? Did you check?" The woman hesitated for a moment, then shook her head, admitting, "No, it seems it wasn't locked." The sheriff and I exchanged glances, then asked for permission to inspect the house. After examining the boy's bedroom and the front door, we concluded that there were no signs of forced entry. Informing the parents of this, we speculated that Bill might have left the house on his own and gotten lost. We considered this initial version the most likely, and decided not to mention the possibility of abduction to avoid worsening the parents' anxiety further. After realizing the scale of the problem, we contacted the precinct requesting assistance. We also reached out to neighbors, quickly forming a search party to meticulously comb the surroundings. Starting our search near the house at the edge of the forest, I stumbled upon a child's toy. It seemed to have been forgotten in haste or dropped in flight. Summoning Sheriff Harding, we inspected the nearby area together and soon stumbled upon a trail that couldn't go unnoticed. It was again that same enormous footprint we had seen before. The sheriff, upon seeing it, froze for a moment, then squatted beside it, lighting a cigarette, lost in thought. After a short pause, he stood up and, addressing me, instructed to document the find. Then, as if deciding something for himself, he plunged into the woods. I carefully documented the location of the toy and the footprint, taking photographs and notes in my notebook. Thoughts of what could have happened to Bill and what creature left this track haunted me. After about 20 minutes, Sheriff Harding returned from the woods, looking pensive. After a brief pause, as if gathering his thoughts, he shook himself and motioned for me to come closer. Issuing orders for the remaining colleagues to continue the search, he and I got into the patrol car and headed in a direction unknown to me. When I asked where we were going, the sheriff replied that we needed to visit someone. I didn't fully understand how this was related to our current investigation, but I nodded in understanding and decided not to ask unnecessary questions. Apparently, the sheriff had in mind someone who could help us find the missing boy or shed light on the mysterious tracks we had discovered earlier. We drove along a road running alongside dense forest. With each mile, the trees seemed denser, their branches sometimes arching over the road, creating the illusion of a tunnel pierced by the rays of the morning sun. The forest filled the air with freshness and subtle scents of earth and vegetation, particularly noticeable in the early hours of the day. Suddenly, the sheriff turned onto a narrow dirt road leading us deeper into the woods. The road wound its way between the trees, and with each turn, it seemed we were delving further into the Green Kingdom. After driving about half a mile along this almost forgotten trail, we approached a house nestled amidst the forest. The house was entirely ordinary, as much as possible in such a secluded place. It was a single-story building with a low roof covered in dark brown tiles, which blended well with the surrounding nature. The walls of the house were painted in a serene shade, which had peeled off in places, showing signs of time and weathering. Around the house sprawled a small plot of land, adorned with wildflowers and grasses, lending the place a special secluded coziness. In front of the house, engulfed in the greenery of the forest, we were greeted by a man in jeans and no shirt, busy chopping wood. Next to him stood an old pickup truck, from which loud rock music blared, filling the surrounding space with energy and rhythm. Despite our arrival, the man showed no interest and continued his work, as if we were mere shadows on his land. After we parked the car and got out, we stood at a distance, not wanting to intrude on his personal space, and waited. Minutes passed slowly until the man finished his work. Noticing us, he approached the pickup truck and turned off the music, thus interrupting the stream of sounds that had filled the air until then. After a short moment of silence, Chris addressed us. "Sheriff Harding, what do I owe the pleasure of your attention?" "Hello, Chris," replied the sheriff, his tone serious but friendly. "We need your help. It's urgent." Chris, slightly surprised by such an address, responded, "Help, you say? But as you can see, I'm busy," waving his hand towards the chopped wood. "This concerns the disappearance of a child, and it perhaps involves it," continued the sheriff, as if choosing each word carefully. The sheriff's words made Chris flinch, and he asked questioningly, "Sasquatch?" To which the sheriff nodded. This confirmation instantly changed Chris's attitude towards the conversation. His interest clearly piqued, and excited by the news, he said, "Well, why didn't you say so right away? Come in." And he led us into the house. As we stepped inside, I was greatly astonished. The walls were adorned with various trophies, from huge deer and bears to more exotic ones, as if taken from the pages of books about unknown creatures. Among them were replicas of stuffed mythical beasts, each with its own plaque. In addition to the trophies, the walls were adorned with antique maps and photographs from his numerous expeditions, where Chris was captured in various corners of the world, from snowy mountains to dense tropical forests. On the shelves were books on cryptozoology, scientific papers, and hunting magazines, as well as collections of rare minerals and artifacts found during his travels. In the center of the room stood a large wooden table cluttered with maps, compasses, night vision cameras, and other equipment for exploring the unknown. On one of the shelves, attention was drawn to a meticulously investigation with Chris and showed him photographs of the huge footprints. The hunter paused for a moment, studying the images with a serious expression. His gaze kept shifting between the photos and the sheriff, as if he was trying to piece together all the details of the story in his mind. Finally, he spoke up. "We might have to spend a few days in the woods, so we'll need to pack supplies and a tent." Upon hearing these words, Chris immediately began gathering supplies. He moved around the house with the confidence of someone who knows exactly what he needs. First, he went to the pantry, from where he brought several packets of dried food, bottles of water, and other necessary provisions for survival in the wilderness. Then he headed to the gear closet, where sleeping bags, a camping stove, flashlights, batteries, and a multitude of other items essential for extended stays in the forest were stored. Chris also didn't forget about safety. He took a first aid kit, a map of the area, and a compass, as well as his reliable hunting rifle in case of encounters with wild animals. He carefully packed all of this into a large backpack and additional bags. Once Chris finished preparing, he meticulously loaded all the necessary supplies and equipment into our car. With everything now on board, we were fully prepared for the upcoming expedition into the depths of the forest. Arriving at the house where the child went missing, we found that the search efforts were still ongoing. Officer Harris approached us, informing that there were still no positive results. Sheriff Harding, seemingly prepared for such news, nodded as if expecting such an outcome. He explained to the officer that we were going into the woods for a couple of days of search and instructed them not to cease the search operation around the house and to keep us updated with any news. Then we headed towards the edge of the forest where the track left by the unidentified creature was found. Chris squatted beside the track, beginning to study it carefully. He looked for any signs that could help us understand the creature's direction of movement or behavior. After a brief analysis, we entered the forest, ready for extensive searching. As we made our way through dense vegetation, we continued our journey deeper into the forest. Chris, leading our small group, tirelessly scrutinized the surroundings, searching for any signs of the cryptid's presence. He seemed completely absorbed in the search process, his eyes not missing the slightest detail. The biggest challenge in detecting cryptids is that they can either erase their tracks or simply don't leave any. Chris mused aloud, peering into the shadows between the trees. I don't know if it's their natural or supernatural ability, but following their tracks is extremely difficult. But the one we're following did leave some clues. His words added a sense of mystique and uncharted territory to our journey. Soon, our persistence was rewarded. We discovered a second clear track left by the creature. It was as gigantic as the previous one, and unmistakably indicated that we were moving in the right direction. As we trudged through the forest, our path occasionally led us to clearings bathed in bright sunlight, and then into thickets of dense shrubbery where sunlight barely penetrated through the dense canopy of trees. The forest trail meandered, constantly forcing us to adjust our direction based on the tracks found. Chris, leading our small group, carefully scanned the surroundings for new evidence. At one point, we veered off course and had to backtrack after realizing our mistake. Soon, our path led us to another obvious trace left by the creature. It confirmed that we were heading in the right direction. However, our progress was suddenly halted by an unpleasant discovery. On one of the forest clearings, we found the carcass of a dead bear. The animal lay on the ground, its head missing. It had been severed with such force and precision that it instantly sent shivers down our spines. There were no signs of struggle or other traces around the carcass. Everything looked as if the attack had occurred suddenly. We stopped to examine the scene. Chris cautiously circled the bear's carcass, trying to find any clues that could help us understand what had happened. The heavy stench of death hung in the air, mixing with the natural scents of the forest, creating a strange and unsettling feeling. I still couldn't believe what was happening. At first, it seemed to me that it was all not serious, and the sheriff might be looking for imitators of this creature. But seeing this carcass made me feel uneasy, and doubts began to creep into my mind. After a thorough examination of the bear's carcass, we continued our journey deeper into the forest. The sun began to slowly descend towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, heralding the onset of evening. Realizing that daylight was coming to an end, we began to look for a suitable place to camp for the night. Soon we found an open patch of land that was perfect for setting up camp. This spot was fairly level and situated on a rise, providing good visibility of the surrounding area and protection from potential runoff. Without delay, we pitched our tent, creating a cozy shelter for the night. Then we gathered twigs and dry branches for a campfire. As darkness fell, the fire crackled to life, casting a warm light on our tired faces and creating a sense of coziness and safety amidst the vast forest. Several stones were arranged around the fire, on which we placed our simple dinners of dry rations and canned food warmed over the flames. Sitting by the fire, we quietly ate our dinners, enjoying the relative calmness and warmth of the fire. Around us, the sounds of the nocturnal forest could be heard. The rustle of leaves, the calls of nocturnal birds, and the distant howling of wolves. Sitting by the fire, enveloped in the darkness and silence of the night forest, I decided to learn more about the mysterious creatures that could be lurking in its depths. "How long have you been searching for this creature?" I asked Chris. For a moment, Chris seemed lost in distant memories before giving an answer. "It started back in childhood," he began. "There were always legends about Bigfoot in our town, and those stories always fascinated me. Once, when I was young and perhaps quite foolish, I decided to venture into the woods in search of it." Chris smiled, reminiscing about his youthful adventure, but his eyes remained serious. "I got lost. They searched for me for a whole week. During that time, I survived in the forest, feeding on berries and nuts. One night, I thought I saw a figure. At first, I thought it was help, but upon closer inspection, I realized it wasn't human. The figure was huge and gray. It seemed to notice me and glanced around. I managed to hide in dense bushes. The creature approached, surveyed the area, but finding nothing, disappeared." His voice sounded tense, recalling that moment of fear and bewilderment. "I sat trembling in the bushes, and after that encounter, I couldn't forget it. They found me, and I told the story, but of course no one believed me." He sighed tiredly and pulled out a flask from his pocket, offering me whiskey. Declining the offer, I watched as he took a few sips and continued. "So when you came to me today and showed the tracks, I was so excited. I've been looking for evidence of their existence for so long, and after all these years, it has manifested itself again." We sat in silence, absorbed in his story. Chris's story ended when suddenly a noise came from the bushes, making us turn sharply. My heart raced faster as I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it towards the suspicious sounds. We approached slowly, the piercing light of the flashlight sliding over the bushes until it illuminated something gray and massive hidden among the foliage. For a moment I froze, trying to understand what was before me. As the flashlight rose higher, it revealed a huge, hairy face with fangs, reminiscent of a monkey. The creature met us with the fiery gaze of its eyes and grinned horribly. Instinctively, I reached for my gun, and at that moment the creature swiftly disappeared into the night forest. We chased after it, but it vanished without a trace. Standing in the complete silence of the night forest, I turned to the sheriff and said, trying to contain the tremor in my voice, "Boss, it really exists. It exists." After thoroughly inspecting the surroundings and finding no more clues, we realized that chasing it on such a night was a bad idea. Deciding to wait until morning, we returned to the campfire, but sleep hardly came to me that night. At dawn, we resumed our search. With the first rays of sunlight bathing the forest in its warm light, the events of the night before seemed distant and almost unreal. But the further we progressed along the trail, the clearer it became that we had encountered something inexplicable and very real. Discussing what had happened, we tried to find a logical explanation, but every option seemed unconvincing. Soon we came upon a dense thicket stretching for miles ahead, leading to rocky mountain ridges towering on the horizon. It was clear that our path lay through this thicket, which was so dense that direct sunlight could not penetrate through its thickets, shrouding everything in semi-darkness. We stopped at the entrance to the thicket, looking into its dark depths with a sense of nervousness and fear. This place might not seem so scary if it weren't for yesterday's encounter with the unknown. Fear of the unknown, reinforced by our fresh memories, made us think twice before entering this dark place. Chris told us that he had explored this forest many times before but had never seen this place, which was strange. After exchanging glances one last time, full of determination and readiness for the unknown, we stepped into the dense thicket. The initial silence of the forest instilled a sense of calmness, and we cautiously moved forward, peering into the surrounding nature and anticipating an encounter with the unknown. But soon the atmosphere began to change as we stumbled upon animal skeletons and scattered bones, strangely missing skulls. This detail seemed particularly alarming to me, creating the impression that we were not just in the forest, but in some sinister trap or even a graveyard. Continuing our search, hoping to find any trace of the child, we came across a small boot forgotten amidst tall grass. This discovery suddenly gave us a glimmer of hope. Perhaps the child was still alive and our search was not in vain. However, with each step deeper into the forest, the bones became more numerous, as if we were walking through a silent graveyard of animals, each of which had contributed to this grim landscape. Our attention was drawn to the unpleasant smell of decay, which grew stronger as we approached. Gathering our courage, we headed towards the source of the stench, and soon found a decaying cow carcass among the rocks. The area around it was swarming with flies, whose buzzing created a grim symphony of death. With a high probability, it was Miller's missing cow. Without a word, we left the place, eager to get away from the unbearable stench and the grim thoughts it evoked. We continued our journey, keeping in mind the image of the found boot as a reminder that our search was not over yet. A sense of unease and urgency grew with each step, urging us forward through the dense greenery and the secrets that this ancient forest held. As we ventured further into the forest, in one of the small clearings hidden among the trees, we stumbled upon something resembling a shrine or altar. In the center of the clearing stood a massive stone, on which strange symbols and imprints resembling huge footprints were laid out. Surrounding the stone, as if guarding it, were skulls of various sizes, from small animals to those belonging to large mammals. Among them was one object that caught our special interest and awe. A large skull, whose shape resembled that of a human, but its size and some features were so unusual that it could not be attributed to any known species. Along one side of the clearing, long branches and sticks were neatly arranged, forming something akin to a wall or barrier, each of which was wrapped in hairs and fabrics, differing in texture and color from those of the ordinary forest animals. These hairs seemed rough and thick, as if they belonged to a creature whose existence we could only guess at. Next to the altar lay several large stones arranged in a certain order, forming a shape reminiscent of a star or compass. On one of the stones were engraved images depicting silhouettes of creatures similar to what we had seen last night. Hairy, massive figures with sharp fangs. As we carefully examined the altar, trying to decipher the meaning of these mysterious objects, a sudden fierce roar from behind made us turn sharply. But where we expected to see the source of the sound, there was no one. The creature skillfully concealed itself in the dense thicket, leaving us in tension and uncertainty. Instantly drawing our weapons, we tried to remain vigilant when a sharp sound came from the other side. Either the same beast was incredibly fast, or there were several of them. We stood back to back, preparing for a possible attack from any direction. The creature moved with incredible speed, allowing us to see only fleeting silhouettes in the semi-darkness of the forest. Suddenly, huge boulders, threatening to crush us upon impact, began to fly towards us from an unknown direction. Dodging these deadly projectiles became a real challenge. Suddenly, the sheriff opened fire, and without hesitation, we joined in the shooting. But our bullets seemed to either miss the target or be powerless against this creature, which continued to unleash its stone fury upon us. As we tried to dodge, one of the stones struck Chris's arm with such force that the bones were instantly broken and he fell to the ground screaming in pain. We rushed to his aid, helping him up. At that moment, the sheriff shouted, "Run! We need to run!" We ran. The sheriff supported the hunter, and I covered their rear, shooting at the pursuing creature. The shots and cries of the beast merged in the chaos of the chase. As we retreated, I continued to shoot until I noticed that my companions had disappeared from sight. In panic, I began to look around for them when suddenly a powerful blow knocked me off my feet, and I lost consciousness, plunging into dreamless darkness. When I came to, a 6-year-old boy stood over me. It was Bill, the boy we had desperately been searching for. His presence filled me with relief, which quickly turned to bewilderment as I tried to understand where we were. Looking around, I realized that we were in a dungeon, a room with a low ceiling enclosed by a cage made of logs. Peering outside, I understood that we were in a cave, and our cell was just one of its many recesses. On the floor lay the skin of a beast. I looked at the child. He was trembling all over and terrified. Approaching him, I hugged him, trying to reassure him and promising that we would escape, although inside I doubted my words. Calming down, the boy soon fell asleep and I gently laid him on the skin, pondering how long he could have been sleeping in safety. After making sure that Bill was safe, I turned my attention to the grate, trying to find a way to open it. Discovering a mechanism with a peg, I futilely tried to pull it out, realizing that without the right tool, I couldn't manage it. Looking into the depths of the cave, I saw numerous skulls scattered around the room, and in the center, the fresh carcass of a deer. This sight filled the air of the cave with a terrifying atmosphere. Suddenly, the creature entered the cave, huge, covered in gray fur. Its heavy breathing filled the space as it approached the deer carcass, tore off its leg, and began to chew on the raw meat. Noticing us, the creature glanced in our direction. I held my breath as it approached our cage. I stepped back to the other end, trying to keep as much distance between us as possible. The creature looked truly terrifying. Its small eyes stared at me intently, studying. Then, unexpectedly, it threw the remains of the meat through the bars, and then retreated into the depths of the cave. As soon as the creature left the cave, silence fell, giving us hope of rescue. I tried to use this moment to find a way out of the cage, pulling on the bars one by one in search of the weakest link. Despite all efforts, success eluded me until suddenly a noise was heard from outside. To my surprise and relief, the sheriff managed to enter the cave. He gestured for silence and quickly inspected the cage. Seeing the peg, he forcefully knocked it out with his boot, thus opening the door. I quickly grabbed the child, and we cautiously stepped out into the cave. The sheriff waved me to follow him. We silently made our way through the cave, and I couldn't help but look around. Everywhere there was an eerie feeling of abandonment and danger. In one corner, my attention was drawn to the skeletons of people, scattered around the corners of the cave. This sight filled me with fear and realization of how dangerous this creature could be. I understood that we were not just dealing with a myth or legend. Before us was a real threat, capable of horrifying deeds. Navigating through the dark corridors of the cave, we tried to move as quietly as possible to avoid attracting the creature's attention. Every rustle, every unexpected sound made us freeze. But under the sheriff's guidance, who either knew the cave plan well or was just lucky in finding the way out, we continued our quiet progress towards freedom. When we heard distant roars, the sheriff hurriedly urged us not to pay attention and quicken our pace. A shot into the air he fired after his words was probably a signal to Chris, who was distracting the creature from us at that moment. We ran hastily. The cave was in the mountains, so we had to descend a steep slope before reaching familiar foliage. We didn't look back, trying to cast aside all fears, although the sounds of roars echoed from afar. When I asked the sheriff if we would wait for Chris, he replied that they had agreed to meet near our camp. I nodded and we continued to run, not looking back, afraid that the creature might be following us. This continued until we reached our camp, where we spent the night. Stopping, we began to wait for Chris. As evening fell, we decided not to light a fire to avoid unnecessary attention. As darkness fell, we grouped together trying to keep warm. Suddenly we heard rustling in the bushes. I instantly drew my pistol, preparing for the worst as the rustling continued, making us strain to peer into the darkness. And suddenly, a figure emerged from the bushes. It was Chris. We breathed a sigh of relief and hurried to embrace him, rejoicing at his return. But his gaze was troubled. He kept looking back. With a worried expression, he said that we needed to leave urgently. His words filled the air with a sense of urgency, and we quickly gathered our belongings, preparing for further escape from the threat that still seemed to lurk in the shadows of the night forest. In the dark of the night forest, it seemed as if nature itself held its breath, awaiting the outcome of our mad escape. The sheriff, Chris, and I, with Bill in my arms, dashed through the darkness, carving a path between the trees, whose shadows seemed like huge sentinels of this ominous world. Every step on the soft forest moss seemed to produce sounds louder than thunderclaps, and our hearts beat in unison with the frantic rhythm of the chase. The sounds coming from the depths of the forest filled the air with a sense of impending doom. The roar of a creature born from the very shadows shattered the night, reminding us of the closeness of the danger that sought to engulf us. We didn't know how far this monster was pursuing us, but every rustle behind us made us speed up, as if death itself breathed down our necks. The air was filled with cold and dampness, and the branches of the trees, like dead fingers, tried to grab us, slowing our pace. In the forest, devoid of light, pitch darkness made our imagination paint the most terrifying pictures, giving every shadow the form of our pursuer. Each shot fired by the sheriff into the night in hopes of repelling the creature only heightened the feeling of hopelessness, adding elements of a cruel survival game to our escape. We didn't know if we would manage to escape this unknown threat, but we understood. Stopping meant the end. Making our way through the thicket, Experiencing the weight of the night terror, we suddenly saw light ahead. It was a ray of hope in the endless darkness of our despair. Joyfully, we ran towards it, each step bringing us closer to salvation. And soon, before us lay the miller's farm, the very same farm we had visited before. With the sheriff and Chris, despite exhaustion and injuries, we quickly approached the farm. Seeing the familiar paddock, the sheriff leaped over it first, then helped Chris, and finally I handed him the child before jumping over the fence myself. Looking back one last time, I noticed a figure standing in the shadows of the trees, staring at us. Indicating to my companions, we all stared at this mysterious entity together. For a moment the world stood still, and we stood facing each other, separated by darkness and uncertainty. Then the huge figure, whose presence filled us with horror, disappeared into the depths of the forest. With relief, we exhaled, allowing ourselves to take a deep breath for the first time in a long time. The events of this night would stay with us forever, like a heavy dream from which we wanted to wake up. We headed towards the miller's house in search of shelter and rest after the exhausting flight. Looking back one last time at the sinister darkness of the forest, I silently wished myself and my companions that we would never again encounter that creature that tried to engulf us. This forest seemed to hold many secrets, but some of them were better left unsolved. It was early morning when Richard took his dog Baxter for a walk. They walked along the edge of the forest, among ancient pines and fresh grass covered in dew. The dog got a little wet, but it didn't stop him from enjoying another cheerful walk with his owner. Soon they reached a stream, which murmured quietly and shimmered in the light. Richard was feeling a bit tired, so he decided to sit on the nearest boulder. Contemplating the beauty of the morning nature, he involuntarily recalled the past years. He was already 70. Not that he had aged drastically by this time, but time had taken its toll, and he had become less mobile and energetic. He lived in his house on the edge of the forest, which he acquired after his wife's death. She had been gone for about 5 years now, and her absence had a strong impact on him. Loneliness had gripped his soul, sometimes suffocating him to the point of being unbearable. That's when Sarah, his elder daughter, bought him a puppy. Taking care of the animal gradually began to dispel the melancholy, and over time, Richard found it easier. As he watched the running stream, he remembered walking in a similar place with his wife once, and a solitary tear rolled down his face. Interrupting his thoughts, he heard the dog bark. The dog ran around as if asking to continue the journey. "Sorry, Baxter, I'm getting up," the old man said, getting up and continuing along the trail. The walk didn't last long. Richard decided to return earlier and prepare a festive lunch. Today was his late wife's birthday, and he wanted to mark the occasion. When he opened the gate, he realized it wasn't locked. Someone had come to him, probably Michael or Sarah. Only they knew he kept the keys under the geranium pot. He lifted it and made sure the keys weren't there. Then he walked into the house without concern. Opening the front door, which was also unlocked, he walked into the kitchen, where he found a man around 35 years old of short stature, skinny with black hair. It was his son Michael. He was leaning into the open refrigerator door, searching for something inside. When he saw his father, he straightened up, and instead of greeting him said, "Damn, old man, your fridge is empty again. What do you even eat?" Richard sighed tiredly and walked past him sitting on a chair. "There's bacon in the cupboard, you can take it," he said. "Great," Michael said. Leaning down, he opened the cupboard door, took out a plate of bacon, and after popping a piece into his mouth, sat on a chair opposite and said, "How have you been? It's been a while since I was here. Baxter misses you, but here he is, by the way." Michael beckoned the dog and threw him a piece of bacon. "I see everything's fine with you, whereas things aren't going so well for me." At this point, Richard looked at his son and pondered where he had gone wrong. They raised 2 children. Although their family wasn't wealthy, they managed to provide both with a university education. The elder, his pride, graduated with honors, then got a good job, got married, and had 2 children. The younger one, however, dropped out of school and, associating with the wrong people, got involved in shady dealings. They and his wife always hoped he would mature and straighten out, but it never happened. Michael constantly got himself into trouble. Perhaps this partly contributed to his wife's death. She loved her son and constantly worried about him. Their savings went into paying off his debts, and one day she left them unable to bear the pressure. Then Richard cut off all ties with his son, and after selling their large house in the city, moved to this secluded place. But the estrangement didn't last long. One day Michael came to him, apologized, and promised to do better. He got a job at a car repair shop in town and seemingly stopped associating with those bad guys. Richard forgave him, as he loved his son. Perhaps their excessive love with his wife had ruined him. They should have been stricter with him in his childhood. Also, he was constantly absent at work and didn't pay attention to his son. So Richard partly blamed himself for what had happened. "Here's the thing, I need your help," Michael said. Seeing his father's displeased face, he quickly added, "No, I don't need money." "Then what do you want?" Richard asked in surprise. After he asked the question, Michael pulled out his smartphone from his pocket, opened the local news website, and handed it to his father. Richard squinted, trying to understand what it was, then stood up, went to the cupboard, took out his glasses, put them on, and slowly sat back down to read. Here's what was written there. On Tuesday, a young couple went for a walk in the woods, where, according to their words, they encountered a mystical creature known as a Wendigo. They miraculously escaped, barely managing to flee. Currently, the frightened couple is in the hospital undergoing treatment, including psychological assistance. After this incident, there were disputes online about the truthfulness of their words and the existence of supernatural beings. The heated debates were fueled by a local millionaire, who announced that he would give $1 million to anyone who brings video or photo evidence of this creature. As a sign of his seriousness, he created a special account, which he handed over to the local authorities. This announcement caused a stir among local enthusiasts, who rushed into the forest in huge crowds. We hope to learn soon whether the Wendigo really exists, or if it's just the imagination of cryptozoologists. Reading the article, Richard nodded. This doesn't bode well, he thought. He looked up at his son and asked, "So what do you want?" "Didn't you understand?" asked the son. "You spent your whole life as a ranger in this forest. Remember, you told me once that you encountered this creature. Why don't we go there and take a photo, then we'll become rich? It's a chance of a lifetime." After his words, Richard remembered that day. They and his partner were patrolling the area when they felt a chill in the middle of the summer day. What happened next often haunted him like nightmares. They barely survived then, and never ventured into that part of the forest again. These memories sent shivers down his spine, and he became angry with his son. Taking the nearby cane, he began to strike him with it, saying, "Idiot, do you think this is a joke? This is really dangerous. If you came here for such nonsense, you better leave. I thought you remembered your mother's birthday, but you've come up with some nonsense again." Michael tried to defend himself from the blows, trying to calm his father down and howling in pain with each hit. Soon they reached the exit when he cried out, "Stop. I'm not asking this just for myself. I was recently at Sarah's and she's having big problems now. Something happened to her husband. I'm telling you the truth. Stop. Ow." Richard pushed his son out the door, saying that Sarah was already grown up and could handle it herself. Then he slammed the door, locking it. Michael's moans could still be heard on the doorstep, but soon he left, not getting what he wanted. Though Richard was angry, he was worried about the news about Sarah. She was his favorite and never caused any trouble. What happened to her? He thought. He took out his phone and called her. She didn't answer immediately. Her voice sounded tired, which worried her father. He asked how she was and requested her to come over. She said everything was fine reluctantly, and agreed reluctantly to visit him. She came the next day. She brought her children with her. Jonathan and Emily were 10 and 7 years old, respectively. When they saw their grandfather, they ran up to him happily and hugged him. Richard loved his grandchildren and often spoiled them. After kissing the children, he hugged Sarah, who had a big belly. She was expecting her third child. He noticed her tired and worried face. Leaving the children to play with the dog, they went to the kitchen where Richard began to inquire about what had happened to his daughter. Sarah didn't want to worry her father, but she finally gave in. It turned out that her husband's company went bankrupt, and he's dealing with lawsuits and other problems. She can't go to work because of her pregnancy, and all this piled up on them at once. Richard silently listened to her, pondering something. Then the children rushed in, interrupting their conversation. After spending half a day with her father, Sarah and the children left him. He stood on the porch, watching them leave, and waved goodbye to the children. When the car disappeared around the corner, Richard continued to stand there. He watched the beautiful sunset and pondered something. An hour passed. His face showed that he had made a decision. He entered the house and dialed his son's number. A disgruntled voice sounded on the other end. Richard only said a few words, that he agreed and that Michael should be with him in the morning. He didn't listen to his son's joyful shouts, just hung up. Then he went to the chest of drawers where their family photo was kept. It showed his wife and children when they were still young. Looking at the photo, a warm smile appeared on Richard's face. He remembered the times when he was happy. Early in the morning, he started his old pickup truck and headed to town. The journey took half an hour. The first thing he did was go to the hunting store. He hadn't been out anywhere for a long time, so he needed things for the trip. There he was, greeted by a 45-year-old man dressed in denim overalls and a red shirt. It was Jeremy Stronghold, his old acquaintance, who was surprised to see the old man. "Hey, Richard, what brought you here?" he said, shaking his hand. "Hey, there's something I need to do. For that I need a couple of things." Richard handed the list to the salesman, who turned it over, scratching his chin. "As for the flamethrower, I'm not sure. There might be some left in the warehouse." He went out the back door and soon returned with the necessary items. There were a first aid kit, a camping pot, a machete, a flashlight. The salesman also pulled out a flamethrower, saying that luckily there was one left. It was a small device with a fuel tank. It could easily fit into a backpack. After that, Richard picked up a rifle. Jeremy looked at him suspiciously, squinting, and when he received the payment, he asked, "Listen, Richard, aren't you going to the forest for that creature? You spent your whole life in it. You must know its secrets. For such money, even such an old wreck like you can take action." The old man didn't reply, just nodded his head. Taking the goods, he left the store while Jeremy watched him with a long, grim stare. Richard needed to stop by one more place. It was a small market where they sold organic food. They also sold chickens and their eggs. He walked among the cages and chose the biggest and fattest one. After making the purchases, he hurried home. His wayward son probably already awaited him. When he arrived home, he saw an unfamiliar Jeep decorated with skulls and flames. Richard didn't like it. He entered the house and saw a stranger. It was a man in his 30s with long curly hair, dressed in colorful attire. From his appearance, it was clear that he was some kind of hippie, though Richard didn't know what they called such people these days. "Who are you?" he asked. But before the man could answer, his son rushed out from the next room, saying, "Old man, where have you been?" Then Richard asked Michael again, "Who is this?" "This is my buddy, Billy. He will help us with the filming. Don't worry, I've already settled with him about the share," his son replied. The old man grumbled, looking at the pair with dissatisfaction, and went to get ready. Going up to his bedroom, he opened the chest of drawers and pulled out his old ranger uniform, which he had kept all this time and which had already gathered dust. Shaking it, he put it on and looked at himself in the mirror. It still fit him well. Satisfied with what he saw, he adjusted the collar and went downstairs to continue getting ready. Soon he brought out 2 backpacks in which he put tents, sleeping bags, and other necessary items for the trip. He handed one to his son and took the other one himself, also slinging the rifle over his shoulder. Billy carried the filming equipment, a couple of cameras, and some other device. Michael, seeing his father wearing it, said, "What are you doing, old man?" But then fell silent, understanding something. After that, Richard locked up Baxter at home, leaving him food and water for a couple of days. Going out into the yard, he pointed to the chicken coop, telling his son to take it. Michael was surprised and was about to ask why they needed it, but seeing that his father was already in a bad mood, he just picked it up. When they stepped outside, Michael thought they would go by car, but the old man headed towards the forest. Stopping at the edge, he turned to his son and said, "Before we go any further, I have one condition. You'll give half of the money to your sister." "As you say, I was planning to do that anyway," he replied. The old man nodded at that, and they continued their way. They slowly made their way through the dense forest, stepping on the soft ground strewn with pine needles and autumn leaves. Twigs sometimes crackled under their feet, and around them there was only the sound of nature, the rustle of leaves, the singing of birds, and the distant sounds of unknown animals that occasionally awakened in this dense world. They moved forward, relying on lightweight hiking poles, occasionally stopping to look around or catch their breath. Richard, despite his age, walked confidently and purposefully, leading them through thickets and avoiding fallen trees. He knew this forest like the back of his hand, having spent most of his life here. Michael, on the other hand, seemed less confident in this area, but still tried not to lag behind his father. His gaze constantly slid over the surrounding trees and bushes, searching for something unusual or threatening. Billy carried the camera on his shoulder, occasionally stopping to capture one or another landscape that caught his eye. His gaze was full of curiosity, but deep down he felt anxious, as the purpose of their journey was far from ordinary. As they delved deeper into the forest, the surrounding nature gradually changed. The trees became older and denser, and the undergrowth thicker, creating the feeling that they were entering another world. The air was filled with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, enhancing the atmosphere of the unknown and mystical. Finally, they emerged into a small clearing, beyond which lay a low fence marking the boundary of the cemetery. It was an old Indian cemetery, forgotten and abandoned by time. Ancient tombstones and stone slabs with long faded inscriptions stretched along uneven rows, while wild flowers and shrubs grew between them. The place exuded a sense of peace, but at the same time sadness for the departed worlds. This was a landmark for Richard. They needed to go strictly north from here until they reached a small valley. They stopped for a small break, taking out a couple of sandwiches from their bags, which Richard had prepared in advance. Chewing on the food, Michael asked his father what this place was. The old man didn't reply immediately, as if recalling something. Then he said that once there was a sanctuary here, belonging to one tribe. An Indian acquaintance of his told him about it. They worshipped a spirit here that ruled these lands. Every year offerings were made here, but over time, people started leaving, and the sanctuary was abandoned. And so, since there were no more offerings, the spirit could be angered. That's why his acquaintance asked him not to go to this area under any circumstances. But of course, Richard didn't listen to him, which almost ended in tragic consequences. Finishing their meal, the guys were ready to set off, but then the old man pulled out a huge dagger from his bag and menacingly approached Michael. "Old man, what are you doing?" he exclaimed in fear. But Richard kept moving towards him, saying nothing. When he reached his son, who recoiled in fright, the old man bypassed him and went to the chicken coop, opening it and pulling out a chicken. It started flapping its wings, trying to escape, but he held it firmly and carried it towards a small altar. Various symbols were carved on it, but the main one was a deer skull with horns. Holding the chicken by its legs, Richard made a swift stroke with the knife, causing blood to spill, and its head flew off to the side. After it stopped moving, he laid it at the foot of the altar. The guys watched this scene, mouths agape. Meanwhile, the old man, after this, grabbed his belongings and headed further down the trail. The guys snapped out of their trance-like state and hurried after him. They continued through the dense forest until it gradually began to thin out. Soon the trees cleared and marshy terrain began. Frog croaks and insect chirps filled the air. Richard led the guys, trying to stay on solid ground and avoid the bogs. As they passed by the water, they noticed a skeleton at the bottom. The water was crystal clear, so they could see it in detail. Most likely, the skeleton belonged to a deer. It was hard to tell for sure as its skull was missing. This was somewhat unsettling. Where had the head gone? After a brief pause and recording it on camera, the travelers moved on. Finally, the marsh ended and a slight ascent began. After that, they walked along a plateau covered with bushes until they reached the valley below, which was covered in dense forest, looking somewhat ominous. Suddenly, a flock of birds soared above it as if startled by something. Richard stopped and said that they would make camp for the night here. They set up their tents and lit a fire. It was starting to get dark, so they hurried to prepare dinner. After cutting up some meat, they cooked it in a pot, then added water and let it boil. After that, they added some vegetables and potatoes. The result was a kind of stew, which turned out surprisingly tasty. Billy remarked on it, to which the old man said that food cooked over a fire always tastes better than stove-cooked. When they finished eating, darkness had fallen, and Richard began to explain that tomorrow they faced a dangerous path, especially when they entered the forest located in the valley. Therefore, they needed to be extremely vigilant and cautious, as well as film everything, as the creature could appear at any moment. The guys silently nodded. They were scared. This place inspired some kind of horror. You couldn't feel it just by watching a video or hearing a story. You had to experience it on the spot, as if you were under the influence of some field. The trio continued to sit, discussing various things. Richard talked about his experience as a ranger, recalling the most vivid cases when suddenly a scream rang out from somewhere. It was a soul-piercing cry, as if the victim had experienced unearthly horror. The guys jumped up and looked around, their faces reflected fear. They tried to determine the source of the sound, but darkness surrounded them. It was a new moon, so there was almost no light from the Earth satellite. Suddenly, they heard another scream, this time from a different direction. What could it be? They turned to the old man, but he sat in the same position, quietly sipping tea, as if he hadn't heard anything. He asked the guys to sit down and calm down. They complied, albeit reluctantly, constantly looking around for danger. Richard explained that this was the harbinger of the Wendigo, and when travelers heard it, it meant they had to leave. These screams would sound all night, so he pulled earplugs out of his pocket and handed them to the guys. Putting a pair in his ears, he himself went into the tent. The guys were shocked by his composure, but it seemed that he had already experienced this and was handling it better than they were. Before lying down, they recorded on the camera. None of them could fall asleep. Terrifying screams echoed through the camp all night, interspersed with the old man's snores. In the morning, Richard emerged from the tent and saw the tired faces of his companions. They had dark circles under their eyes and disheveled hair. It was clear that they had tried to sleep but couldn't. The old man shook his head disapprovingly, but then remembered how he himself ended up here the first time. After that, he lit a fire and brewed coffee. Passing each of them a cup, he told them to prepare for the journey. They packed up their tents and cleaned up after themselves. Then Richard pulled a flamethrower out of one of the bags and handed it to his son. Showing him how it worked, he explained that he should use it when he said so. The son silently nodded, asking no questions. They left the bags at the camp, taking only the weapons and cameras with them. After that, they slowly made their way down. As they descended, Michael asked his father why he wasn't afraid. He remembered his face when he first told him about this place, and back then, the old man's face expressed horror. Now he was calm and collected. Richard replied that sometimes a man had to let go of fear for the sake of his family's survival. These words didn't sit well with his son. Something troubled him. Soon they reached the edge of the forest. Here, huge boulders lay as if the remnants of a once great wall. Approaching closer, they noticed strange symbols on them. Billy had already turned on the camera and was recording. Their path now lay through the forest. It seemed mysterious and eerie. It was unclear what created such an atmosphere. Perhaps the trees grew close to each other, or the fact that almost no other plants grew under them. Finally, as they entered, they headed deeper inside, constantly looking around. Everything was quiet for a while. They walked another half-mile when suddenly they felt it getting colder. Michael felt himself freezing, but other than that, nothing else happened. Richard pondered. Could it be that he appeased the spirit and it didn't attack them? Then that was a problem because they needed recordings with it. Suddenly, he saw tracks on the ground. He leaned in closer to get a better look. The tracks were large, much larger than any human footprint, with long, elongated fingers ending in sharp claws. Richard frowned, trying to recall if he had ever seen anything like this in his many years as a ranger. But there was nothing similar in his memory. He followed the tracks, which went in a straight line through the forest floor, bypassing bushes and jumping over fallen trees. Every step the Wendigo left behind was clear and confident, as if the creature had no trouble moving in its natural environment. Suddenly, the tracks abruptly ended at the edge of a small ravine. Richard looked around, searching for a continuation, but found nothing. It seemed the creature had silently leaped over the obstacle, leaving no sign of its presence on the other side. He looked at his son and his friend, contemplating whether to go further, when suddenly they heard noise behind them. They quickly turned around and prepared their weapons. Richard ordered Michael to hide behind a tree, while he stood behind another, raising his gun. Meanwhile, Billy jumped into the bushes from where he was filming. They waited in suspense, expecting to see who would emerge from behind the trees. A shiver ran through them, and sweat trickled down their faces when suddenly two people appeared before them. They were dressed in hunting suits and were carrying weapons. It was evident that it was a father and his son, who was about 25 years old. Richard recognized the elder one. It was Jeremy, the owner of the hunting store. But what was he doing here? They saw that they had been discovered and raised their hands in a gesture of goodwill. Richard emerged from behind the tree and asked them what they were doing there. "Sorry, old man," Jeremy replied. "I figured you knew where to find this creature and couldn't miss this chance. We've been following you all this time, and judging by these tracks, it seems it wasn't in vain. Let's be civilized. Whoever finds this creature first gets the reward." "Bastard!" Michael exclaimed, but Richard stopped him. "Let them do what they want. This is not a place for arguments." What worried him more was the fact that they probably hadn't made offerings like he did, which could anger the spirit with their arrival. As if reading his thoughts, a strong wind blew. It was unnatural in such a dense forest. The wind was very cold. At first it was quiet and silent, but then it began to intensify and turned into a howl. Richard shouted for everyone to gather together and hide near the crown of a massive tree. It was difficult to do so. Nearby, near the roots of the adjacent tree, lay Jeremy and his son. The wind intensified, almost turning into a hurricane. The guys were afraid they would be swept away. Moreover, they began to feel cold, causing their teeth to chatter, and steam started pouring out of their mouths. As soon as the wind subsided, pitch darkness fell around them, darker and denser than ever at night in the forest. It felt like they were blinded. The silence that followed the storm was so deafening that every rustle made their hearts skip a beat. Suddenly, whispers emanated from the depths of the forest, as if the wind continued to howl. But now it sounded like words in an unknown language. The whisper quickly grew, taking on ominous tones, until it turned into a deep, rumbling voice that surrounded them from all sides. Richard and his companions huddled together, trying to find shelter in the embrace of the forest. Their breathing became heavy and erratic from fear. Then, unexpectedly for everyone, the darkness receded, and a figure appeared on the edge of the clearing. It was tall and emaciated, with long, sinewy arms ending in claws. Atop its head sat a deer skull with long, twisted antlers, which stood out against the darkness. The creature's eyes glowed red, piercing the darkness. The Wendigo stood motionless, observing them, and its breath was heavy and deep, filling the air with cold. The creature took a step forward, and the earth beneath its feet rustled with dry leaves. Its movements were slow and deliberate, as if it were weighing each step. Suddenly it raised its hand towards them, and in the air appeared a thin, almost invisible layer of frost, which began to slowly descend to the ground, covering it with a white blanket. Richard felt the grip of his gun handle moistening in his hands. He turned and asked Billy if he had made the recording. Billy trembled and didn't answer immediately, so Richard had to shake him, which brought him to his senses. After that, Richard repeated his question, and Billy answered affirmatively. The deed was done. It was time to run. He shouted to his son and his friend to follow him, but then he saw Jeremy jump up, grabbing his weapon, and head towards the creature. The old man yelled for him to run and not to do anything stupid, but the hunter didn't listen. Standing next to him, his son opened fire together with him. Loud shots echoed through the forest, deafening it, but the Wendigo kept standing, and then, as if dissolving into thin air, appeared a few feet away from the hunter. Swinging with sharp claws, it cut his weapon in half, causing the father and son to recoil in fear. Richard shouted for them to run and didn't look back at them, rushing in the opposite direction. Two of his companions followed after him. As they ran, Richard felt the cold emanating from behind. Turning around, he saw everything around turning into an icy chill, and Jeremy and his son turning into pieces of ice. This sight shocked him. It was painful to see his old friend perish. He realized that the situation was much more dangerous than he had thought. Clearing his mind, Richard focused on escaping. They ran with all their might, trying not to look back. Suddenly, an impenetrable darkness fell again, and to his horror, he lost his companions. Turning on his flashlight, he found that the light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, which plunged him into despair. So he wandered in the darkness, crying out and calling for his son, but no one answered. Suddenly, from somewhere to the side, he heard a painfully familiar voice that he hadn't heard in 5 years. This voice twisted his insides. He turned and saw his wife, Martha, standing literally 10 feet away from him, warmly smiling, and then she called him to her. Richard's mind went blank. He missed his wife so much that he threw caution to the wind and quietly, slowly walked towards her. With each step, she came closer so he could see the wrinkles on her face. It seemed that all troubles had left him, and he found himself in paradise. When he was just a couple of feet away from her, suddenly a bark sounded, which made him snap out of it. His wife's face turned into a terrible grimace, and she hissed. After that, the darkness dissipated, and he saw his dog Baxter. Tears streamed from Richard's eyes. He realized he had fallen into a trap, but it was difficult to break free from it. He sat down and petted his dog, thanking him for saving him. The dog just happily wagged his tail as if saying, "What are you talking about, master?" He didn't have time to ponder how his dog ended up here. At that moment, memories of his son flared up in his mind with renewed strength, pushing him to search. The path was long and exhausting, but in the distance, the flickering of flames from a flamethrower caught his attention. With his heart racing, he headed towards the source of light. Approaching, he found his son alone amidst emptiness, seemingly struggling with an invisible enemy, turning around and shouting, continuously directing the stream of fire. In despair, Richard began to call him, trying to snap him out of it. For a while, the young man didn't react, but finally, his gaze cleared of fear at the sight of his father. Panic reflected in his eyes, seeing the destruction he caused. At that moment, The old man decisively took his son's hand, and together they hurriedly searched for Billy. Billy was quickly found. Out of habit, he had hidden in the bushes. Reunited, they set off again, feeling the relentless pursuit at their heels. It seemed like darkness enveloped them, bringing with it a piercing cold. Looking back, Richard saw the silhouette of the monster behind them. This vision almost weakened him, but the old man found the strength to run as fast as his exhausted body could. It seemed like the cold began to recede, but a sudden cry from his son made his heart stop. Turning around, he saw his son fall into a small pit, from which it was difficult for him to escape. In the distance, he saw the figure of the Wendigo swiftly rushing towards them. Michael tried to climb out, calling for help. "Father, help me!" These words made Richard see not an adult son before him, but a little 3-year-old boy whom he once loved to carry on his back. This boy, tearful and desperate, pleading for help, called to him. He remembered how he first held him in his arms when he was just a baby, how his wife whispered to him that he looked like an angel, how he first put him on a bicycle, how they spent time together at his job in the park. Then Richard made his final choice. Rushing to his son, he helped him out of the pit, snatching the flamethrower from his hands, and yelled at him to run. But his son couldn't believe his words. The old man grabbed him by the shoulders, looked into his eyes, and said, "Run and live in a way that you won't be ashamed of later, and be sure to take care of your sister." Michael refused to leave him. Tears streamed down his face, but his father shouted again for him to run, and he ran. Finally, Richard could breathe calmly. He grabbed the gun and opened fire, but it was futile. So he switched to the flamethrower. He waited for the creature to close the distance. Suddenly he felt something rubbing against his legs. He looked down and saw his dog. "No, Baxter, go run, save yourself." But the dog didn't leave, just barked, then turned around and snarled angrily at the approaching monster. When the creature was just a few feet away from him, he ignited the flamethrower, and the stream of fire shot forward. There was a horrifying scream, and an incredible coldness enveloped everything again, freezing everything around. It froze Richard, who stood unwavering, and his dog stood in a fighting stance next to him. The last light faded from the old man's eyes, ending his journey. The monster approached his head as if trying to peer into his soul. From the openings of its skull, where its nose should have been, cold vapor burst out. Meanwhile, Michael and Billy ran out of the woods and headed back to their camp. Michael was engulfed in grief. There was no expression on his face. Gathering their belongings, they headed back home. They arrived by evening. To their surprise, Sarah was there. Apparently, she had released Baxter. Her face showed deep concern, and upon seeing her brother, she hurried towards him. He, lowering his head, didn't want to speak, but eventually he told her about what had happened. When he finished, there was a slap. It was Sarah slapping her brother, and in tears she went upstairs. Michael didn't react to this. He felt he deserved it and worse. Meanwhile, Billy called rescuers, who headed to the scene but found no one there. However, the recording they made was made public and caused a stir. Money was raised, and Michael handed part of it to Jeremy's family. He also helped his sister's husband. Finally, he had money, but having it didn't make him happy. This incident radically changed his life, and he tried to live in a way that wouldn't disgrace his father's name. 6 months later, on a quiet winter morning, Sarah decided to visit her father's house. She never decided to sell it. Leaving her child with the nanny, she arrived at the place. The old house hadn't changed at all. Upon entering, she started cleaning. Wiping the floors and dusting the shelves, she noticed a photo album on top of the dresser. Opening it, Sarah discovered the chronology of their family's life. Memories flooded her and she burst into tears. But suddenly, from outside, she heard the barking of a dog and then the sound of the front door opening. Who could that be? She wiped her tears, put the album back in place, and headed for the exit. When she stepped into the hallway, she saw a person standing in the doorway, smiling warmly at her. Her legs lost their strength and she took a step back, saying, "You?" Sitting in a cozy local bar, I slowly finished my third mug of beer. I was trying to forget the recent troubles that had befallen me, but the whirlwind of thoughts kept me restless. Around me there was a gentle hum of conversation and soft music playing, but I barely noticed, lost in my thoughts. Suddenly, someone's hand touched my shoulder, pulling me out of my reverie. Turning around, I saw a man in his 40s standing next to me, named Bill. He was a local hunter with not the best reputation. Once, after a hefty dose of drinking, he got into a fight with some friends and beat up a few guys. Among them was the son of an influential person in town, which caused a big scandal. The police intervened, but the situation was somehow resolved in the end. "How's it going, Mike?" he asked, smiling. "Looks like you've had a tough week." "Well, something like that," I mumbled. Apparently he already knew about my problem. "I'll have a dark beer and get him another one I'm treating," he said to the bartender. I wanted to refuse, but I didn't say anything. I didn't have the strength or desire to interact with anyone right now. I just raised the beer mug and emptied it. Soon the bartender brought me a new one, and Bill continued, "Women, they're something else, aren't they? Not all, of course, but you've run into the one you'd better not mess with." He saw my angry look and added, "Easy, easy. Rumors about your affairs have been circulating in town for a long time. I heard she ripped you off for a large sum. Tough luck, buddy." I didn't reply, just kept staring into my mug. Yes, I had problems, but I didn't want to share them. I was already thinking of leaving, but Bill said something that made me stay and look at him with interest. "You know, we've known each other for a long time, and I know you're a good guy. I have an offer for you. Would you like to make some quick cash?" he said, lowering his voice towards the end. "Is it related to drugs?" I asked, skeptical. "Drugs? No way. Let me tell you something, and I hope this stays between us," he said, to which I nodded affirmatively. So one guy approached me. He's interested in prehistoric animal bones, mammoth tusks to be precise. I don't know what he wants them for. Maybe he sells them to the Chinese as medicine or just hangs them on the wall. That's not the point. The main thing is how much he's offering for them. He glanced around and, leaning closer, whispered, "He's offering 50 grand for one tusk. Can you imagine? Find 20 tusks, and you've got $1 million in your pocket. Not bad, huh?" I pondered. It was good money. I had debts of $200,000, and if I joined Bill, I could pay them off quickly. But there's no such thing as a free lunch. There must be some catch. I asked him about it. He looked around, seeing that no one was eavesdropping, whispered quietly, "Yes, the thing is, it's illegal. The place where we want to dig for bones belongs to the federal government, and excavations there are prohibited. But on the other hand, those places are very wild and hardly anyone ever goes there, so the risk is very low, but it's there. We have to be prepared for it, but if we take the risk and it pays off, we'll make a good amount of cash. Bill looked at me with a questioning look, waiting for my answer. I remained silent. Honestly, anyone who knows me well would say that I'm not the risk-taking type. I always preferred to act thoughtfully. Some would call it indecisiveness, but at least my life was always calm. No risks, no problems. The only time in my life when I did something thoughtlessly was when I got involved with her, and it didn't lead to anything good. So I needed to think. I told Bill that I would call him tomorrow and give him an answer. He nodded understandingly and said there was no rush. I thanked him for the beer, then paid and left the bar, returning home. Standing on the porch, rummaging through my pockets for keys, I noticed a letter sticking out of the mailbox in the door. Opening the door, I pulled it out. It was a notification from the bank. It said that I had to make the first installment of $10,000. There was a week left until it was due. I stared at the envelope for a long time, then sighed tiredly, stepped out onto the road, and looked at the house. It was left to me by my deceased parents, and all the warm memories were associated with it. I couldn't lose it. No need to think about it. I took out my phone and dialed Bill's number. A quiet ring and, "Hey, I'm in," I said. "Oh, I see you didn't take long to think. Good. We're planning to head out tomorrow, but today we need to buy some stuff, so I'll pick you up in the morning, around 10, so be ready." "Got it," I replied and hung up. The next day, around 10 in the morning, I heard a car horn. Peeking out the window, I saw it was Bill in his old pickup truck. I put on a cap, locked the house, and got into his car. We headed to the city center where various shops were located. We arrived quickly and stopped in front of a household goods store proudly named Homestead Hearth. It belonged to my acquaintance, whom everyone called Strange Fred. I don't know where this nickname came from, in my opinion. He was the most ordinary person. We entered the store. There was no one inside. I looked around. The shelves and racks were neatly arranged, offering customers a wide range of goods from kitchen utensils to decorative interior elements. First, we went to the hunting and fishing section, where I bought a waterproof jumpsuit and rubber boots. We also got a hat with a mosquito net there. Then we headed to the section where household appliances were sold and approached the place where huge water pumps were standing for water pumping. Soon, Fred came up to us. "Hey, buddy," Bill greeted him. "Give us some advice, something suitable. I need a device that would effectively pump out water but also allow me to irrigate with a strong jet." The shopkeeper paused, then began to explain the intricacies of each model. As we stood listening, suddenly the bell on the entrance door chimed. We turned to see a man in his 50s entering the premises dressed in a green shirt and dark green trousers, topped with a hat. He was the local park ranger. I didn't know him, but I noticed Bill seemed slightly nervous. Soon he approached us. "Hey Bill, Fred, how are you?" he greeted us, nodding and tipping his hat. "Not bad," Fred replied. "What brings you here?" "I need to purchase a couple of flashlights for my colleagues," he said, noticing our selections and giving us a thorough look. Then he asked, "Bill, we haven't seen you around much lately in the woods. What's up?" "Been busy, boss," Bill replied, trying to appear casual. "Some work came up, so I didn't have time for hunting." "I see. And what are you guys picking? Basement flooded?" the ranger asked. "No. Flooded my cousin's ranch. He asked for help," Bill replied. "I see. Well, I won't keep you then," he said, and headed towards other shelves. We watched him as he left the store. Bill chose 2 devices, paid, and we loaded them into the pickup. It was evident he wanted to leave quickly. As we got into the car, he said, "That was Clayton Barrett, the local head of the Environmental Protection Department. A meticulous guy can nitpick about anything. and I have a feeling he's onto something. We need to be careful with him." After his words, I glanced at the store, seeing the ranger leaving, the one Bill was talking about. Bill started the pickup, and we set off. I looked back and saw the park ranger watching us as we drove away. The next day, Bill picked me up around 4 a.m. It was still dark, the streets empty and quiet. Suppressing yawns, feeling the sleep still clinging to me, I got into the car. We silently navigated through the city street shrouded in early morning darkness, soon leaving them behind. As we drove, the surroundings gradually came to life with the first signs of dawn. Darkness gave way to silvery rays modestly piercing through the horizon. In the distance, nature began to awaken, filling the air with sounds and movement. Wild animals probably started their morning rituals too. The air was fresh and cool, carrying the scent of morning dew and earth, instantly sharpening awareness. Alaska in the summer was astonishing. With each passing kilometer, I was increasingly impressed by the beauty of the surrounding nature. Endless forests, mist-covered mountains, and crystal-clear rivers. But soon, our smooth ride on the concrete road changed as we turned onto a rugged trail leading into the wilderness. The road here left much to be desired. Potholes, rocks, and tree roots created a true off-road experience. I was being tossed from side to side. Bill skillfully maneuvered between obstacles, seemingly familiar with every twist of this road. Soon, all signs of the road disappeared, and we followed a faint trail, presumably left by someone who had traveled before us. I asked Bill who else would be in the team. He said they were already there and I would meet them soon. I nodded, and we continued our silent journey. After about 2 hours, we were driving along a small stream when I saw the outlines of a gray pickup truck in the distance. Next to it were several tents, and people were moving around them. Soon we stopped beside them and got out of the car. 4 people approached us. Their clothing was adapted to the local conditions. Tall boots, insulated jackets despite the summer season, and headgear to protect against insect bites and sun rays. They eyed us curiously. Then Bill stepped forward and said, "Hey guys, meet another helper I brought along. This is Mike, my old friend. He works as a mechanic at Alex's workshop." I nodded in greeting, and Bill began to introduce me to his friends. He pointed to the first one. He was a tall, lanky man around 35 with a bowl-cut hairstyle. His name was George. Then there were 2 guys in their 30s who were twins with blonde hair and blue eyes. They were Max and Alex. They smiled warmly at me, and I felt they were good guys. The last one was slim, of short stature with a daring look. I knew him. We went to the same school. Not a pleasant guy, his name was Kevin. When our eyes met, he smirked cunningly but didn't say anything. Having introduced ourselves, we started unloading the pickup, pulling out pumps, tents, and fuel. Taking my tent, I set it up next to the others and placed my belongings inside. Then I joined the rest. They were already discussing the approximate location for the excavations led by George. He had been doing reconnaissance work these past few days, and according to him, he found a small rise not far from the river. That's where we would start. I surveyed the surroundings. Along the stream where we stood, a couple of trees grew. Mostly it was open space, which was advantageous for us because digging near trees would be very difficult due to the roots. By the way, about digging in Alaska. At this latitude, permafrost prevails, so you can't dig with a regular shovel here. That's why we needed pumps. We discussed the plans and divided into 2 teams. With me were George and Kevin. I went and changed into a waterproof suit, put on boots, and donned a hat with a mesh. It was impossible to work without it here, as a cloud of mosquitoes flew around, which managed to get into my eyes, mouth, and nose in the short time we were here. After we were ready, we lifted the pumps and took small shovels. Then we set off. We walked about 200 or 300 feet along the river when we saw a large rise not far from the shore. We set up the pumps near the river with one end of the pipe inserted into the water and the other, longer end, stretched towards the rise. The second team did the same, but from the other side. It turned out we would be washing the soil from both edges. Once everything was set up, George turned on the pump. It ran on diesel, and the sound of the engine echoed throughout the area. I held the hose and directed it towards the ground. A huge and strong stream of water hit the ground and slowly began to wash it away. It was a long and exhausting process. The stream poured out of the hose, water spreading over the ground. But soon a small creek formed, flowing back into the river. While I held the hose and directed the stream, George and Kevin worked with shovels, clearing away the washed-out soil. We continued digging until 2 in the afternoon when Bill announced it was time for lunch. I looked at our progress. We had indeed done a good job. Most of the soil had been washed away, but I was very tired. It was truly heavy work. After turning off the pumps, we walked back to the tents, where we lit a fire and warmed up some food. Sitting around it on folding chairs, we began to eat. After eating, the guys started talking about how they would spend the money. Soon it was my turn. Kevin sarcastically asked, "I heard you got into big debts because of a skirt." I glared at him angrily and didn't reply. Bill nudged him to shut up. George and the twins looked at me with curiosity, but I wasn't going to tell them anything. I got up and headed to my tent. As I lay there, memories of the past month came flooding back to me. I remembered how it all started. I met her when she brought her car to our service center for repairs. She was stunningly beautiful, and I fell for her at first sight. I had never taken risks or approached such women, but here I did, and to my surprise, she responded positively. Things escalated quickly, and soon we started dating. Surprisingly, everyone around me told me she was using me, but I didn't believe them. I was so happy. A month passed, and she suggested we start a business. Showing me a plan, she said she needed money and offered me to join her venture. Of course, like an idiot, I agreed, mortgaging my house and giving away all my savings. I waited for her to return, but she disappeared. I searched for her everywhere, but couldn't find her, and then I realized I had been deceived. I reported it to the police, but they couldn't find her either. Of course, the news spread throughout the city. This incident left a deep mark on my soul. I struggled with it for a long time, but then I accepted it and decided to move on. Eventually here, I lay in a tent, preparing to engage in illegal fishing. About half an hour later, I heard Bill calling. After changing, I immediately returned to work. We diligently dug all day, but to our disappointment, we didn't find anything valuable. A gloomy mood hung in the air. The next morning, we got up even earlier and continued working with unabated diligence, but the result remained the same. Eventually, it was decided to relocate to another location in search of luck. On the third day, early in the morning, we packed up the tents and set off downstream. After covering 2 miles, we found a spot that seemed very promising. We set up camp and after changing, immediately got to work. Water and mud flowing on the ground along with a swarm of mosquitoes were our companions, but nobody complained. Lunchtime was approaching when we heard Kevin's loud cry. We ran to him and saw him pointing at something white sticking out of the ground. "Jackpot!" yelled Bill. After that, we brought the hose and began carefully washing the soil around the bone with a stream of water, and soon we managed to pull it out. It was a huge mammoth tusk about 10 feet long. Its sharp edge was broken. It was huge and heavy. Happy and satisfied smiles were on the faces of the guys. I myself rejoiced like a child receiving a Christmas present. We set aside the tusk and enthusiastically continued excavating. Where one had been found, another was expected. The day was coming to an end, and we stood in a clearing by the river and looked down. There on the grass lay 4 huge tusks. Wide smiles adorned our faces. And why not? In 3 days we earned $200,000. In the many years I spent working as a mechanic, I had never been able to earn money so quickly. In the morning, we loaded the tusks into the pickup and covered them with a tarp. Now we needed to transport them without getting caught. I decided to go with Bill, while the guys stayed behind to search for a new location. We followed the same path we had come, but moved slower and more carefully to avoid damaging the cargo. When we reached the concrete road, we sped up but tried not to break any rules to avoid attracting police attention. Soon we entered the town and stopped at a traffic light. Suddenly, another car pulled up next to us. I turned my head and saw Clayton Barrett behind the wheel of his SUV. He was turning his head trying to see what we had in the trunk. I glanced at Bill, who whispered without moving his lips, "Don't panic. Just pretend you didn't see him, relax, and look straight ahead." I followed his advice, but I couldn't help but feel nervous. We were driving with cargo, and the one who could arrest us for it happened to pass by. It's how lucky you have to be to get caught like this. Soon the traffic light turned green, and we moved forward. I looked in the side mirror and saw the Ranger turn right. I breathed a sigh of relief. Bill smiled and said, "How's the adrenaline rush?" I just smiled a little in response. Soon our path led us to our destination, a vast area where huge warehouses were neatly arranged. We carefully turned into one of the passages between the rows and headed towards one of the impressive hangars. Bill honked briefly, and as if on command, the gates slowly began to open. We drove inside, where a man in a blue work jumpsuit was waiting for us. He was about 30 years old, and he looked like a thug. At least that's what I thought. After we stopped the car and got out, Bill approached the man and greeted him. Then they engaged in conversation. I stood aside, unable to hear their conversation. Soon they headed to the tarp, and opening it, they started pulling out the tusks. I joined them, and after unloading, we took turns putting the tusks on the scale while the man recorded the weight in his notebook. After weighing all the tusks, the man pulled out a calculator and started counting. Bill stood nearby, checking the calculations. After that, the stranger opened the pouch on his belt, took out a stack of dollars, counted them, and handed it to Bill. After that, Bill and the stranger shook hands as a sign of the deal's completion. We got back into the pickup and slowly driving away from the hangar, we left the area. As we drove, Bill said, "Good deal, we made $195,000. "Not bad," I replied. We decided to celebrate and had lunch at an expensive restaurant in the city center. After that, Bill headed to the store to buy tools for work and fuel for the pumps. I, on the other hand, taking my share from him, went to the bank and paid off part of my debt. Then I went home. Bill picked me up closer to 2 p.m., and we headed back into the woods. When we returned to the camp, there was nobody there. Only cars and tents stood. Where did the guys disappear to? Perhaps they found a new spot. We had 2 hours until dark, so we decided to look for them. Moving along the river, we heard the sound of pumps in the distance. Soon we found them working near a large burial mound. It was already considerably excavated, and upon closer inspection I noticed a couple of tusks sticking out of the ground. Bill noticed it too and eagerly ran up to them. "Incredible! How did you guys find this place?" he asked in amazement. "It's George. He discovered it this morning during reconnaissance," one of the twins said joyfully. "As I passed by this place," George continued, "I suddenly felt some kind of call. I looked around but found nothing except for this mound, so I decided to check it out. I called the guys and we started digging here, and that's when we uncovered these tusks. But the strangest thing, look." He pointed to the tusks. And we approached to examine them in detail. "See, they're embedded in the ground and there's no mammoth skeleton here, as if someone deliberately placed them here." We looked at them, speculating on what it could be. Various hypotheses were put forward, but Bill interrupted the debate and said that it was getting dark and it was time to return to camp. The next morning, inspired, we set out to continue yesterday's work. With 6 of us, the work progressed faster, and by lunchtime, we had exposed the edges of the mound. To our shock, we counted 24 tusks buried in a circle at equal distances with their curved sides facing inward. It resembled some kind of ritual circle. Bill walked around the circle with a happy smile, saying, "This is worth more than $1 million." The others were also delighted with the find. Compared to last time, this was a real jackpot. I wanted to be happy too, but for some reason, I had a bad feeling. As we were excavating, I felt a pressure on my chest. I don't know if it was because of the weather or simply fatigue, but something weighed heavily on me. We pulled these tusks out of the ground and brought them to camp. Then we held a meeting. The thing was, we had only dug up the edges of the mound. It was still largely intact. The question was whether to continue digging. Kevin spoke up and I looked into his eyes, noticing a greedy glint. "It's only 3 o'clock. Why don't we continue excavating? Who knows what else we might find?" Everyone pondered. Ideally, we needed to transport the tusks we had found as soon as possible, as there was a threat that local rangers might show up. But this was the wilderness, and it was unlikely that anyone would stumble upon it. Personally, I was against it, but the others agreed, so there was nowhere to go. The sound of a diesel engine echoed through the area, and we resumed digging. The work was in full swing. Chunks of earth broke off, fell, and washed into the river. Evening approached, and aiming the stream of water, I dislodged a large chunk of earth when I noticed a skull protruding from the surface. I lowered the hose in alarm and called the others over. Then I continued to blast water while Bill helped dig with a shovel. Soon a skeleton appeared before us. Surprisingly, it hadn't disintegrated into pieces, but remained intact like a monolith. The skeleton was seated in a lotus position, as if meditating before death. When we washed away the remaining dirt, we could examine it better. At this point, George couldn't hold back and cursed, while the other guys just stared in astonishment. I, too, was in shock, trying to quell the trembling. The thing was, while the skeleton resembled a human instead of a typical skull, it had an elongated muzzle, like an animal, with a row of sharp teeth covering the jaw. It had 6 fingers on its hands, folded in a prayer-like pose, and instead of feet there were paws. What on earth was this? We examined the skeleton from all angles, trying to understand what kind of creature it was. At first, everyone was scared, but over time we tried to figure it out. Was it a hoax or what? Bill suggested that someone in ancient times might have assembled this skeleton from different parts of humans and animals. It sounded reasonable, and we agreed with it. Leaving the skeleton behind, we returned to camp. It was getting dark, and we lit a fire. After dinner, we enthusiastically discussed ideas on how to spend the money we would earn. We had already forgotten about the last discovery. After an hour of chatting, we dispersed to our tents, and silence enveloped the camp. Only the chirping of insects and the nocturnal song of birds could be heard. I woke up in the middle of the night. It felt like someone was lurking around my tent. At first I thought it might be one of the guys, so I peeked outside but found no one. Then I decided to go relieve myself. Usually we did this behind the camp where bushes grew. I stood next to them and heard rustling nearby. I glanced around fearfully but saw no one. Then the rustling was in front of me. I squinted and saw a dark silhouette. Who could it be? I yelled, but no one responded. So I returned to camp and checked each tent. To my horror, everyone was in their place. Then who was it? I looked around again and noticed silhouettes in the darkness. It seemed like they were watching me and observing my actions. A strong shiver ran down my spine and my heart pounded harder. I walked to Bill's tent, opened it, and woke him up. He sleepily rubbed his eyes and asked what was going on. I told him something weird was happening outside. He got up and went outside. Then I pointed in the direction where I thought the shadows were, but he saw nothing. Neither did I. Everything fell silent, and the silhouettes vanished. Bill cursed at me for waking him up and returned to his tent. Meanwhile, I looked around in astonishment, trying to understand what had happened. Maybe I was imagining things. I returned to my tent and lay down, but couldn't fall asleep. After a while, I heard rustling again. I peeked outside, but once again, no one was there. There was nothing else to do, so I locked the entrance and waited for dawn. In the morning, everyone woke up lively and energetic, except for me. I couldn't sleep. At breakfast, Bill asked me about last night, and I told him what happened. Everyone looked at me skeptically and confirmed they hadn't heard anything. Kevin sarcastically remarked, "He's always been a scaredy cat." I wanted to reply, but Bill told us to calm down. We spent the rest of the time in silence. After the meal, we discussed our next steps. Bill and another guy were supposed to start transporting the tusks. There were so many that it would require multiple trips. The rest were to continue excavating the mound. This time, Kevin volunteered to go. We loaded the tusks onto the pickup truck, managing to load a third of them at once. After the pickup left, we changed clothes and headed to the excavation site. Work progressed quickly, but I didn't feel well. I kept glancing at the skeleton, feeling uneasy. I didn't understand why the others were so calm. Maybe I was just too sensitive. We continued digging around in a circle, narrowing the diameter of the mound. Soon we discovered 4 more skeletons, identical to the first one. The findings were forming a pattern. It seemed that initially there was an outer circle of 24 mammoth tusks, and inside, skeletons were positioned equidistantly along the circumference, all facing towards the center of the mound. When I shared my conclusion with the guys, they were all interested to see what would be in the center of the circle. So everyone started working even harder. Bill returned 3 hours after leaving, and we loaded the second batch of tusks onto the pickup truck. We told him about the discoveries, to which he nodded and said we should keep going. Sometime after lunch, we had dug up almost the entire mound. Stepping through mud and water, I blasted the water jet at chunks of earth which broke off with a squelch when suddenly something gray appeared. This time, it wasn't a skeleton but a mummy. We sprayed water on it, washing away the dirt, and soon the features of this creature became more pronounced. It was truly terrifying and ghastly, covered in fur. Its body seemed anthropomorphic, with a wolf-like head lying in a fetal position, wrapped in a silver chain that surprisingly hadn't lost its shine. When we fully uncovered it, it appeared to lie on a huge stone pedestal engraved with mysterious symbols, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Its eyes were closed, and it seemed completely dried out. We examined the creature with fear, trying to guess whether it had been alive or just an artificial dummy. When we finished digging, Bill and Kevin arrived, and they too began examining this discovery. Discussions began about what to do with all these skeletons. I suggested it would be good to inform scientists and historians about them, as these skeletons could have archaeological value. But the guys were against it, saying we could get arrested and sued, and it was better to leave everything as it was. Kevin, however, liked the chain wrapped around the mummy. He tried to tear it, but to no avail. I wanted to tell him not to touch it, but I stayed silent. Leaving the mound behind, we headed to load the remaining tusks. This time, I volunteered to go with Bill. As we drove away, the guys started a campfire for a snack. I cast one last glance at them, and we disappeared into the trees. This trip was no different from the previous one. We reached the warehouse, and the same man greeted us. After receiving the money, we went to Bill's house, where he left all the cash. Then we went together to Snack Bar and bought food for the guys. After shopping, we headed back to the woods. It was around 5 o'clock when we reached the camp. A strange feeling came over me. Something wasn't right. The guys weren't there. We got out of the car and looked around. The campfire was still smoldering, emitting a small wisp of smoke, indicating that the guys had been here recently. Plates with half-eaten food lay nearby. All of it looked suspicious. It seemed like they had left the camp in a hurry and left everything as it was. After inspecting the camp, we headed towards the burial mound. When we got there, the guys were not there, but something had clearly happened here. Scattered on the ground were skeletons, some of them broken. I also noticed that the mummy was gone. In its place lay only a chain. I picked it up and put it in my backpack, not knowing why I did it, but it was a premonition. Bill pointed at something on the stone pedestal. I approached closer and saw bloodstains. What happened here? Could some wild animal have attacked them? I asked Bill about it, and he said it was entirely possible. Damn, we were almost done with the excavation. Why did this unpleasantness happen towards the end? And what happened to the guys? Bill, being an experienced hunter, started looking for tracks and soon found a couple of them leading in 2 directions. We decided that each would follow one track, but before we split up, he ran to the car and took out radios and flashlights. Setting the frequency, we agreed to immediately stay in touch. As I passed by the trees, I tried not to lose sight of the footprints in the flattened grass. At the same time, looking around, I called out loudly to my friends, but there was no answer. At one point, it seemed to me that someone was watching me. This feeling arose unexpectedly but sharply. Goosebumps ran over my skin, the hair on my arms stood on end. Turning sharply back, I saw that there was no one behind me. Damn, maybe I'm just getting paranoid, getting scared even of my own shadow, I thought. Nevertheless, the footprints on the ground continued uninterrupted. How far could my friends have gone, and what could have frightened them so much? Continuing on my way, I suddenly noticed ahead the beginning of dense bushes. Carefully examining them, I found broken branches, clearly indicating that someone had recently passed through them. Approaching cautiously, I heard a faint rustling from behind the bushes, which made me wary. Carefully, step by step, I began to move forward, parting the branches in my path. As soon as I pushed through the last thicket, a small clearing opened before my eyes where 3 of them sat. It was George and the twins. With relief, I exhaled and loudly called out to them to let them know of my approach. However, upon noticing me, they recoiled in fear. Their trembling and fear-stricken eyes immediately caught my attention. I couldn't understand what had caused such a reaction. "Hey guys, it's me!" I tried to reassure them, but George, alarmed, shouted in response, "Don't come near us, please. Stay away." Stopping, I tried to understand what had happened, what had frightened my friends so much. Upon closer inspection, I noticed that one of the twins was injured. He held one arm bent, which was wrapped in a shirt and covered in blood. "What's the problem? I just came back with Bill, but you guys were gone. What happened? Can you explain to me?" After my words, George hesitantly asked, "Are you really Michael?" "Of course, who else could I be?" I replied. After my words, the guys breathed a little easier, but it was clear that they still didn't fully trust me. So I asked them to tell me what happened. George began to tell. "When you set off, we settled by the campfire and started preparing dinner. I took on the role of chef, and the brothers actively helped me. Only Kevin seemed detached from the common cause, constantly repeating that he was bored. Suddenly, he announced his intention to return to the mummy and retrieve the chain he had found there, which greatly attracted him. Then he headed to the car, armed himself with pliers, and went to the burial mound. Meanwhile, we continued to prepare dinner. After a while, when dinner was ready, we laid out the food on plates and started eating, still waiting for Kevin's return. His absence began to cause concern, and we were about to go in search of him when he unexpectedly appeared. At first glance, he seemed strange to me, but I didn't pay much attention to it, offering him food. However, Kevin, pushing it to the floor, stared at us with an incomprehensible look. Then Alex stood up and demanded explanations. In response, Kevin lunged at him and grabbed his arm so tightly that I feared the worst. Reflexively, I pushed him away, but then I noticed that his face began to change, becoming like a mist. Fear gripped me when Kevin let out an animalistic roar and assumed a threatening posture. In desperation, I grabbed a branch from the fire and hit Kevin with it, after which he lost his disguising guise, revealing to us the mummy we had found earlier. Shocked by what had happened, I attacked the mummy again with a burning branch, making it retreat. It seemed disoriented. It was our chance, and we all together fled. We ran towards the burial mound as I couldn't leave Kevin behind. But when we arrived there, he wasn't there. Seeing that the creature was pursuing us, we rushed into the forest and made it to this place where you found us. I listened carefully to his story, but my mind refused to believe it. A living mummy? What is he talking about? However, the frightened expressions on their faces made me believe their words. Deciding to set aside my doubts, I tried to contact Bill through the radio, but all I heard in response was static. Subsequent attempts to call went unanswered, so I informed my friends that it was time to go back to the cars and leave to get help. It was obvious that Bill would also head there. We walked back cautiously, constantly looking around for danger. As twilight fell, visibility worsened, only heightening our unease. Suddenly, we heard a rustle ahead. We froze in fear, expecting anything. A figure approached us, and when it emerged from the bushes, we recognized Bill. He was injured, moving with difficulty, slightly hunched over and holding his hand to his bleeding side. "Oh my God!" I exclaimed, rushing to him. When I asked him what happened, he didn't respond. His gaze was vacant, as if he were in a trance. George ran to him and put an arm around him, helping him walk. We continued our journey, but something about Bill made me uneasy, although his condition was hard to determine. I turned on the flashlight to light our way. After we had walked half a mile, George suggested taking a break, and I agreed. But when he was about to release Bill, the latter unexpectedly grabbed him by the neck, squeezing hard. George screamed in panic. One of the twins decided to intervene, grabbing Bill by the head. Then something unexpected happened. A wolf's face manifested where Bill's head was. He was a werewolf. He snarled and sank his teeth into George's neck, covering him in blood. We watched in shock as the scene unfolded. But when the creature leaped at one of the twins, I yelled for them to run. But it was too late. The werewolf first caught one, then the other. I watched the scene, thinking my end was near. But then something inside me ignited, the desire to live. I ran as I had never run before. With all my strength, I ran forward, slipping past trees and jumping over roots. Fear rang in my ears. It seemed like the monster was chasing me. Faces of my friends floated in my imagination, but I could no longer help them. The realization that the creature had caught them made me move even faster. My only hope for survival was to reach the pickup and drive away as far as possible. On the way, I saw the familiar burial mound and rejoiced knowing that the goal was not far off. Passing by, I headed towards the camp. Darkness had already enveloped everything around, and I decided not to stop and not to use the flashlight to avoid attracting unnecessary attention. Approaching the camp, I noticed headlights. Someone was already there. Inside me, hope flared that one of my friends had survived. Approaching the car, I noticed a cautious figure. Blinded by the headlights, I couldn't immediately make out who it was, but I heard a shout ordering me to stop. Instinctively, I realized that a gun was pointed at me and abruptly stopped, raising my hands and trying to catch my breath. The figure approached, and I recognized in it Ranger Clayton, whom I had seen earlier. He looked at me with suspicion and asked what we were doing here. I tried to catch my breath and warn him of the danger that might lurk behind. "It's behind me. Be careful," I breathed out. The ranger looked behind me but found no one there. Then he approached me closer and asked if I had any weapons. I shook my head negatively, after which he ordered me to remove my backpack. I complied with his demand, throwing the backpack at his feet. The ranger opened it, checked it, and finding only a silver chain, made sure that I was unarmed. "You can lower your hands," he said, after which he asked how many people were still here and where they were. "They're all dead," I replied. Then he ordered me to tell him what had happened. I briefly recounted the events to him, but it was evident that he didn't believe me, still keeping his weapon ready. Finally, he said to lead him to the burial mound. Approaching the designated spot, we saw scattered skeletons and a pedestal. Using his flashlight to illuminate the scene, the ranger carefully examined the evidence. It seemed that my story was beginning to find confirmation in his eyes. When he asked me to lead him to the place where George and the twins were killed, I, albeit reluctantly, obeyed his command. Clayton kept his gun up, adding seriousness to the situation. As we walked through the forest, we cautiously looked around. I thought about how I was walking this path for the second time and shuddered, turning to Clayton with a suggestion to turn back and call for help. He insisted on continuing, promising to resolve everything on the spot. Despite the expectation of an attack, the presence of an armed man nearby slightly calmed me. Eventually, we reached the spot but found only blood on the ground, no bodies. I was puzzled by what was happening, while the ranger began to survey the area, trying to unravel the events. Suddenly, a noise came from the bushes, and Clayton, aiming his gun, took a defensive stance, then loudly demanded that the unknown person slowly come out. A figure emerged from the bushes, and when I recognized her, I was deeply shaken. It was Sarah, the same girl who had deceived me. With astonishment and shock, I stared at her, unable to believe my eyes. "What are you doing here?" I blurted out. But all I got in response was her sinister smile. My gaze shifted to Clayton, and I saw fear on his face. "What do you see?" I asked him, to which he, visibly nervous, replied, "Is that a wolf or a werewolf?" I was puzzled. In front of me stood my ex-girlfriend, but Clayton's words made me doubt what was happening. Sarah began to slowly approach me, while Clayton, tensely holding a gun, aimed it at her. "What are you doing?" I exclaimed at him, but he only continued to look at her with fear. Suddenly, Sarah made a sharp lunge forward as if about to pounce on me. The ranger reacted quickly, opening fire. "Stop!" I shouted. But then my gaze fell on Sarah, who was thrown back from the shot. At that moment, a creature formed before us. Sarah's figure dissolved, and in her place appeared a huge humanoid wolf, emanating malice and threat. It looked at us disdainfully, ready to attack at any moment. "Oh God, what's happening here?" I muttered, stepping back, overcome with fear and shock. Meanwhile, Clayton kept shooting, and the creature deftly dodged. He continued firing until it vanished into the night darkness. Then, with shock in his eyes, he looked at me and said, "You weren't lying. We need to get out of here." We began our journey back to camp, but the feeling of unease didn't leave us. The creature, like a shadow, pursued us, skillfully using the cover of darkness. It kept appearing from behind trees, making us constantly look over our shoulders, but it always slipped away before we could get a good look at it. This added extra tension, as we couldn't be sure when or from where to expect an attack. Despite the fear and uncertainty that enveloped us with each step, we kept moving, trying not to fall behind each other and staying ready for any surprises. The moon illuminated our path through the gaps in the tree canopy, adding a mystical feeling to our grim journey. Finally, after what seemed like an endless trek, we reached the camp. With relief, realizing that we were relatively safe, we exchanged looks full of concern and questions about what awaited us next. As we were about to get into the car, a werewolf unexpectedly leaped out of the bushes and lunged at the ranger with tremendous force. They both fell to the ground, and the gun flew aside. Trying to help, I rushed to the weapon, but at that moment, the creature turned its attention to me. It leaped, and we fell to the ground. Struggling to fend off its attack with all my might, I noticed a silver chain nearby. Grabbing it, I threw it at the beast, causing it to recoil with a whimper. Apparently, the silver had an effect on it. By that time, Clayton had managed to get up and pick up the gun, opening fire on the retreating monster. Seizing the moment, we quickly jumped into the car. Clayton started the engine, pressed the gas pedal sharply, and we left the scene, blending into the night darkness. As we drove away, constantly looking back, we tried to calm down and gather our thoughts. We had to face a nightmare of the night that would forever remain in our memory. And the fear of possible pursuit by this creature still lingered in the air.